and she's the author of 2 books.
This meeting is being recorded.
And she's also a great grandmother twice, apparently, which is wonderful news. Bev is also a former counselor and chief of the Hatsul First Nation in Williams Lake, BC. And Bev, I certainly hope I pronounced the name of your First Nation properly.
Yep.
Bev is going to speak to us about her award-winning memoir. It's called They Called Me Number One: Secrets and Survival at an Indian Residential School. I've read several reviews of the book, and all of them say that it should be read by every Canadian and be part of the curriculum in every Canadian school. And after reading the book, I gotta say, I completely agree. The book is intimate, powerful storytelling. It's painful, it's heartbreaking to read, but there's also humor and there's hope and there's optimism as she talks about her grandmother, her mother, her daughter, as well as survivors who, like her, took on leadership roles to be a force for positive change in their communities. Bev is going to speak for about a half hour and then take your questions. And we'd like you to put your questions in the chat, which we will monitor. And I guess somebody had suggested it's a good idea to when Bev is speaking, to mute our microphones. And we're really looking forward to this, Bev. Thank you on behalf of the Holy Name Parish Truth and Reconciliation Group. We extend a warm welcome.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you for your understanding. I had to cancel a few presentations that week, and yours is the only one I rescheduled. So I'll just start in with my presentation. It is a written presentation only because I wish I were like some people where it just is clear in their mind where they're going. But if I start speaking about certain things, my mind wanders here and then it goes all over. So I do presentations, I usually write it down. So that's what I'll do. So thank you. All righty. So everything in the Indigenous world usually begins with ceremony, and it is important that I begin with a story about that. A Brentwood box carved by Vancouver Island Coast Salish artist Luke Marston was transferred to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, also known as the TRC, during a special blanket ceremony at the opening of the 5th annual Cowichan International Aboriginal Film Festival in Duncan, BC on April 16th, 2009. The ceremony honored the local artist and recognized the transfer of the sacred box as it was prepared to begin its journeys with the TRC. Luke Marsden said he was honored to carve the TRC Brentwood box and offered it as a lasting tribute to all residential school survivors. The Brentwood box was steamed and bent from a single piece of red cedar and represents the unique cultures of former First Nations, Inuit, and Métis students. Mr. Marsden pays respect to his own grandmother by depicting her residential school experiences at Cooper Island in the carvings. The box traveled with the TRC to its 7 national events throughout Canada and reflects the strength and resilience of residential school survivors and their descendants, and honors those survivors who are no longer living. As the box traveled with the TRC to different provinces and territories, offerings were made to it to commemorate personal journeys towards healing and reconciliation. The Brentwood box has found a home at the Canadian Museum for Human Rights in Winnipeg, and it is the centerpiece of the TRC exhibit in the museum. So I was invited by one of the commissioners, Dr. Marie Wilson, to put my book, They Called Me Number One, into the Brentwood box. And I put my book in the box to help those who had not attended the schools understand why there was so much hurt and pain from that experience. I also wanted to contribute to a part of Canadian history that was not taught in Canadian curriculum. So my book tells the story of 3 generations who attended the schools. My grandmother, who was born in 1896, my mother, who was born in 1925, and me, I was born in 1955. My memoir is one small voice in the surge of survivor voices about the atrocities that took place at these institutions. My memoir makes the point that the social problems that Indigenous people have are not simply because we are Indigenous. This is a human problem that any race in the world would suffer if they were forced to live under the same human rights violations. So the first TRC event I attended was held in Vancouver, BC, at the Pacific National Exhibition Grounds, also the PNE grounds, on September 18th to the 21st of 2013. And to me, the venue seemed unnecessarily large. I thought that aside from former residential school students and their families, I did not think that anyone else would be interested in attending. So when I walked onto the grounds, I was amazed to see so many people, and most of them were non-Indigenous. Lisa Jackson was premiering her video, Hidden Legacies, during this TRC event. The video is about how the residential schools continue to affect the next generation of Indigenous children who did not attend the schools. My daughter and I were in the video, and Lisa invited us to speak to the audience after the video. I went into the building and there must have been easily 2,500 people. Again, mostly non-Indigenous people. There was even a busload of young students who came up from Oregon. After the video, the children asked question after question and were upset when we finally had to close the session because there was another event scheduled for that venue. I was so pleased with the turnout and the diversity of the people who came to witness the event. So even though I was glad that events such as these were taking place, it still brought home to me the injustice of it all. At the TRC event in Vancouver, word quickly spread that the churches had pictures of former students. It was set up in a corner of a building with tables and chairs where people could go over albums and could get a photocopy of the pictures they wanted. Every one of us who had attended a residential school in British Columbia made our way there to see what we could find. My mom was with me when I found a picture of my brother Bobby, who had died in the early 1970s. Found was when he was about 8 years old. I wasn't sure whether to show the picture of Bobby to my mom. I didn't know if it would really upset her to see his young image after all these years. Imagine that, a parent in her 80s for the first time being able to see a picture of her child during his so-called school years. Most parents have all kinds of pictures of their kids growing up through their school years. And we were combing through each album trying to find a remnant of our time spent at the school. I wondered why the schools could not have shared these pictures with the parents at the time. We might have never known those pictures existed if the TRC was not put in place. I did finally show the picture to Mom, and she was sad, but also so appreciative to the religious institutions for sharing. I was upset with her because she felt they were doing us a favor, and the bigger picture escaped her. I let it go because it would not do anyone any good to get upset with her. In the end, I was glad that the TRC made the opportunity for parents and grandparents and former students to finally get pictures of their school years. When I first heard about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I wondered what the reaction from the general public would be. While I was chief during my first term of 1987 to 1993, we were doing work on the social problems in our community. Why did our communities have so many social problems, we wondered? Our communities did not realize at the time how traumatic events could leave a lasting impression. Our Caribou Tribal Council, as it was known at the time, hired Dr. Roland Christian and his team out of the University of Guelph to do a study on the former students of the residential schools. Once we started to examine it closely, it seemed that all roads led back to the residential schools. The results of all kinds of abuses and the fallout were shocking, but everything started to make sense about the social conditions of our communities. It was then that we started looking for ways to overcome the destructive conditioning that we had received at the residential schools. With the report that Dr. Chris John and his team came out with, our tribal council was in demand for interviews with media. I was reluctantly pushed forward by the 3 other chiefs of our tribal council as the spokesperson to speak to the report. 2 of the other chiefs hadn't dealt with their sexual abuse that happened to them, and another one was the son of a priest, so they were all reluctant to speak about it. And I hadn't dealt with mine, but I guess they thought I was the best spokesperson. So all of a sudden I found myself on the front page of national newspapers and being interviewed by television crews. It was overwhelming for me at the time, but I answered the media questions and was very open and honest about the atrocities that had been committed at the St. Joseph's Mission Residential School. It was during the period of media attention that I started to receive hate mail. How dare we accuse the churches of these atrocities? How dare we not be thankful that we received an education from these schools? How dare we complain after all that Canada does for us? I was absolutely horrified to receive these letters, and I threw the letters into my wood stove at home, hoping that the extreme ugliness in them would disappear as well. I did not receive one letter of support or empathy. In addition to that, when my friend Elizabeth Furness first published her book, The Victims of Benevolence, she was working for our tribal council in Williams Lake at the time. The book was about St. Joseph's Residential School, and Liz is non-native. I was shocked when she told me that no one in Williams Lake would agree to sell the book in their store. And then later, when I went to university in 1994 or 95, the subject of residential schools came up in one of my history classes. A young white woman was visibly shaken when the subject was brought up. She insisted that the churches would not do that. While she did not say it outright, she did indicate that these were lies being told about the churches. I was, at the time, still unable to speak about the abuses, and so I remained silent. And so I wondered about the TRC and the reaction it would get. I saw a television news story on September 22nd, 2013, that indicated to me that social awareness and change was happening. A walk for reconciliation was organized in Vancouver to support former residential school survivors and to show determination in rebuilding the relationships among Indigenous people and all other Canadians. Among those in attendance included Dr. Bernice King, Dr. Martin Luther King's daughter, Vancouver Mayor Gregor Robertson, and a delegation of notable government officials and First Nations leaders. The thing that amazed me was that approximately 70,000 people participated and walked in the pouring rain to support the former residential school survivors. That is more than the very popular annual Vancouver Sun Run, and that made a very strong statement to me. When my book came out, I fully expected to get more hate mail. Because my granddaughters are on the front cover and family pictures were on the inside of the book, I warned my family about the expected hate mail and told them to make sure the grandchildren were shielded from any of the comments. I believe that because the Indigenous people started to reveal secrets about the churches and the abuses that occurred, it gave other non-Indigenous people permission to also acknowledge their abuses by the churches, by coaches, by organizations where people were given respect without earning it. I believe that with more than just the Indigenous voices revealing atrocities, Canadians are now willing to listen and are acknowledging the crimes, the racist laws and oppression that Canada has committed. To date, since the publication of my book, I have not gotten one negative report from all the phone calls, the emails, the written letters, and the personal comments when I go out to speak. So I want to talk a bit about the powerful and destructive programming that Indigenous children received at the residential school. Others who did not attend the schools had a hard time understanding the reaction of some of it when it came time to face authority of any sort, white authority of any sort. And Bill Wilson's foreword in the book talks about this, and this is a quote from him. He says, "My personal ignorance of the school made it difficult for me to understand the reaction of even the strongest Indian leaders. I remember being inspired by the attitude, the rhetoric, and even the oratory of some of my early heroes, only to see them wither in the face of white authority, especially government or churches. Nearly every Indian my age or older expressed shyness, nervousness, and a subservient attitude. And I wondered where that came from," unquote. So I'm sure many of you have seen the movie Shawshank Redemption. It's a great movie if you haven't seen it. But there's a scene in the movie where an older gentleman, Brooks, and then later Morgan Freeman's character, Red, are working in a grocery store after just getting out of prison. Brooks and Red, who had spent almost all of their adult lives in jail, cannot go to the bathroom without constantly raising their hand and asking the store manager for permission. The frustrated manager tells both Brooks and Red that they don't have to raise their hands and ask to go to the bathroom each time. And Red says, "When you have spent your life getting permission to pee, you don't know anything else, and your body can't pee without getting permission." So like Brooks and Red, many Aboriginal people have been indoctrinated in a segregated and controlled authority system for so long that we have become prisoners even in our own minds. And I want to relate two stories about how this type of programming can drastically affect a person. The first story is about a cousin of mine who was in her early 20s and had spent probably 10 years at St. Joseph's Mission. She was hired as a recreational worker for our community and worked under a white band administrator. One day I saw her downtown in Williams Lake, and she said she had just come from seeing the band administrator in the hospital. And I knew he was very sick and actually was in the intensive care unit. I thought she went to visit him to see how he was doing, but she had gone to see him to get direction for her job. I was horrified at the time because he could barely talk, and the direction she was seeking was trivial. She could easily have made the decision. And it was not until years later that I realized that, like Brooks and Red, she had been so institutionalized that she could not make a simple decision by herself. She needed permission from the white authority, even if he was on what might have been his deathbed. The other story I want to tell you is about myself, an experience I had when I fell in a store. And in the book I say, because of the number of beatings I received from the strap and other painful experiences as a child, I am surprised at how programmed I still am to endure pain. An incident that happened after I was an adult illustrates this point. I once slipped and fell because of water on the floor of the local supermarket and severely sprained my hand, especially my right ring finger. I eventually had to go to physiotherapy, which was a new experience for me. During treatment, the physiotherapist put small electrode points on both sides of my finger to stimulate the muscles. He asked if the strength of the electric current was okay, and I had not had this treatment before and did not know what to expect, so I said yes. The physiotherapist left to attend to another patient, said he would be back in a few minutes. It turned out that the stimulator was set too high, and the points it touched on my skin started to burn. I could smell my skin burning, and yet I did nothing. I did not scream out or even move. When the physiotherapist came back, he saw what was happening and quickly took the electric rods off my finger. "Didn't that hurt?" he asked. And then I felt stupid because I should have known to take it off myself. But programming from residential school would not allow me to go against what I saw as a white authority figure. And I still have the scars on my finger, and that would have been more than 40 years ago that happened. It is common in many Indigenous communities to think 7 generations ahead to provide and protect the lands and waters for them. In many of the earliest comments by the newcomers to this country, they were amazed at how rich the land and waters were because of the nurturing and caring for the natural economy. The newcomers were also amazed at how free and indulged the children were. Indigenous people felt that their most important resource, aside from the lands and waters, were the children. Orphanages, abandoned children, or child labor were unheard of in traditional Indigenous communities. And so the treatment we received when we arrived at these institutions was shocking to us. The horrific find of 215 graves at the Kamloops Indian Residential School came as no surprise to Indigenous people.
Bev, pardon me. Bev, I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for interrupting. I think you accidentally hit mute.
No, I think I did. Sorry.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Sorry about that. I think a couple of people have been joining late and we've been trying to let them in.
Okay.
So our apologies.
Okay.
I think it just happened though. Okay.
Yeah.
So,
Sorry about that, Bev.
okay. So should I start with the 215 graves again? Is that where I went unmoved?
Sure. Yes, please.
Already. So the horrific find of 215 graves at the Kamloops Indian Residential School came as no surprise to Indigenous people. Unmarked graves of children have been found at other residential schools in past years, and there will be many more finds, and I can guarantee that. In 2013, we were attending a commemoration to all the children who were forced to attend St. Joseph's Mission, the institution I attended. Stories were shared and the elders pointed to where the children were buried. They were not pointing to the fenced off, well cared for gravesite. They pointed in the opposite direction towards the railroad tracks. 9 years later, on January 25th, 2022, the Williams Lake Indian Band released their findings of a small segment of the land surrounding St. Joseph's Mission. They identified 93 sites of potential human burials, and the search continues. I can pretty well guarantee you that at every residential school, there are unmarked graves. And we must not forget the many children like Chani Wenjack, who ran away only to freeze to death trying to find his way home. And we acknowledge the late Gord Downey for his song about Chani and for taking the time as a Canadian to really understand this part of Canadian history. There are hundreds, maybe thousands of Chani Wenjacks who did not make it home, from the 130 to 140 residential schools that operated across Canada over a period of approximately 100 years. We also need to acknowledge the suicides and the fallout of many destroyed lives as a result of the schools. And we have to add the 60s group where Indigenous children were taken and put in foster homes or adopted to non-Indigenous people, not because they didn't have good homes or not because they were starving, it was just because they were Indigenous. Today, we have more Indigenous children in care than we had during the residential school days. And Cindy Blackstock and others have been working for decades to correct this. So it is good to see the outpouring of support from Canadians and around the world. People always comment that there's lots of healing that has to be done in Indigenous communities, and that's true. But it is equally true that the non-Indigenous communities have a lot of healing to do as well. And I will illustrate this by a story. In my community, we have gang activity. They are, to this day, rival Indigenous gangs that have been killing each other since about 2008. My community and another community west of us are the main ones involved. Very soon after being elected chief of my community in 2009, I was summoned to a meeting by the staff sergeant of the Williams Lake RCMP. He did not inform me what the meeting was about, just that it involved our community and that I needed to be there. I went with one of my staff. We walked into a room of approximately 25 white people. During the round of introductions, I realized that all of the social service agencies were in attendance: probation, child and family services, welfare, social housing, and others. And even though there are a number of Indigenous organizations that cater to our people in the area, none were invited. The staff sergeant began the meeting and invited each of the organizations to do a presentation about the gang activity and how it was affecting their organizations and their community in Williams Lake. They had a picture taken from someone in our community who had posted it on Facebook. It was a birthday party for one of our young men, and about 15 of them posed for the picture. The staff sergeant said that those were the boys who were part of the gang, the Indian Outlaws, a name the boys had given themselves. As each organization spoke, I listened, and the staff sergeant wrapped it up by saying that an RCMP member who was present at the meeting had spent time in my community working with the youth. He then turned to my staff member and I and basically said, "What are you going to do about all this, Soda Creek Indian Band? These are your community members creating chaos in our community." I began by addressing the RCMP officer who said he was in my community working with our youth. I asked him who he was working with and why did I not know he was in my community. The staff member who was with me worked with the youth, and his claim of being in the community surprised her as well. I then addressed the rest of the group, asking them if they ever looked at their role their society played in where my young community members were in their lives. These young people are born into a social system that is set up for their failure, and ignorance is a big part of the problem. Many times our social problems are attributed as simply because we are Native Indian. And so I challenged each and every one of those in the room that day who were too lazy to really examine their beliefs. What are you going to do to help change the living situations for these people? What are you going to do so they won't join the Hells Angels to get the material things they desire? What are you going to do to help these young people dig themselves out of the social situations they are born into? What are you going to do to change the structure of a society that benefits only people like you? I also informed the staff sergeant that even though the picture he had on the wall were all young men from my community, not all were involved in gang activity. Labeling them all publicly as gang members put up more barriers for them and increased their chances of getting nowhere in life. Not much was said after that, and I left the meeting angrier than I had been in a long time. The staff sergeant came out to see me at my office about a week later. He informed me that the RCMP officer who had said he was in our community started drinking after years of being sober and had even quit the force. He then had the nerve to try to blame me for this. I had many fights with this staff sergeant, but in the end, we started to communicate. He eventually transferred somewhere else and we never became friends, but he helped make it possible for a few RCMP officers to be stationed in our community. Those RCMP officers got to know us as human beings and started to work with us. The end result is that today, when we see those particular officers, we see their faces first and not their uniform. It took many years, but for the most part, many in our community for the first time ever can call an RCMP officer a friend. Before COVID, along with our elders, they took our youth hunting each year. They had golf tournaments with the youth, and even some of the hardcore young men were opening up to them. One of the RCMP officers learned how to make bannock and makes it for our community gatherings. He even entered a bannock making contest, and after a few years, finally won first place. The gang activity has lessened since they are in the community, and that's a win for all sides. And don't get me wrong, we still have many, many problems with the RCMP. But in our area, at least, those few officers are helping make a difference. So as uncomfortable as it may be to hear, those stories and others of those who struggle need to be told so we can examine and understand how society needs to heal. Racism is a sickness and privilege is a form of racism. Institutions were built that specifically oppressed Indigenous people and others, and privilege allows the perpetuation of the same institutions to continue to oppress, and that has to change. We can't make the same mistakes in modern times. My husband Bill uses the analogy of two runners training for a race. One has the best foods, the best training track, the best coaches, the best shoes, the best of everything to make his performance all it can be. The other is usually hungry, does not have a coach, and trains where and when he can. Now, who do you think's going to win? Our people, and especially our youth, who at one time had all the benefits of their lands, have been displaced and dispossessed. In many parts of Canada, they are now the ones trying to run a race without food, without coaching, and without the proper gear. Some Indigenous communities are doing better than others, but there are far too many communities who live in terrible conditions because of Canada's racist laws and because of the dominant society's ignorance and apathy. Colonialism has created so much trauma in our lives, and residential schools top the list. They took us in our most vulnerable years, our childhood years, and many left these institutions broken with no way to live a peaceful or content life. Indigenous people have a lot to teach, and part of it is in parenting. It makes me happy that there are now books coming out that portray Indigenous ways of parenting as better to raise healthy, well-rounded adults. So what now? In Germany, it is required in schools that everyone learn about the Holocaust. The same needs to happen in Canada. Non-Indigenous people need to learn the full Canadian history, the good, the bad, and the ugly. I have heard people refer to the residential schools as a chapter in the history of Canada. No. Indigenous people need to be front and center for all of Canadian history. If they are not there, then we need to start to ask questions. Where are they? Why are they not in the picture? What is happening with them and without them, and why? In asking these questions, other histories will come out, including the many important contributions of Indigenous people to Canada and to the world. They need to be fully recognized. Indigenous people, once again, need to become a necessary and contributing part of Canadian society. With understanding replacing ignorance, I believe that is possible, but it will take more than a few politicians to change our destiny. And that is why I place my hope in the individual people of Canada who know of the injustices and need to help educate others and help change Canada's future to a more positive one for everyone. And as I keep telling people who apologize to me for the injustices that are continuing to happen today, I tell them, I know you are not personally responsible for these laws and policies, but now that you are aware, you have a responsibility to help change the situation. You cannot turn a blind eye to this, because if you do, you will be doing the same things as your ancestors who made the policies. I hope that individuals make Indigenous and environmental issues front and center until they are dealt with. I always say, in order for all this reconciliation to happen, people need to reconcile with Mother Earth first. Otherwise, the other reconciliation stuff won't matter a few years down the road. So talk to the tribes in your area and find out how you can support them. Don't assume, like the Department of Indian Affairs, that Indigenous people are all the same and one size fits all. Solutions will vary from different areas and tribes, but without dealing with the outstanding Indigenous issues, Canada will never become a country that we can all be proud of. And I just want to end with a few words from Chief Dan George, who was from the Tsleil-Waututh Nation near Vancouver and passed into the spirit world in 1981. His words are still relevant today, and I would ask everyone to remember these few words of his speech when talking about so-called reconciliation or when discussing Indigenous people. And this is where the title of my second book comes from, Price Paid. And Chief Dan George said, "We are a people with special rights guaranteed to us by promises and treaties. We do not beg for these rights, nor do we thank you. We do not thank you for them because we paid for them. And God help us, the price we paid was exorbitant. We paid for them with our culture, our dignity, and our self-respect. We paid and paid and paid." And that's it. Thank you for listening. I'm more than happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Bev, on behalf of the group. I think we all maybe need a moment to kind of reflect, and but we have a little bit of time. If people have questions for Bev, she has a bit more time with us. If we could either, I think it might be easier to put them in the chat or raise your hands. I mean, there's no right or wrong way. Just jump in if you have a question.
I always like going to elementary schools because kids have kinds of questions. They're just not shy to ask any questions.
While people are thinking, where do you get your hope? What do you draw on for a sense of hope?
Well,
there can be positive change.
There was a time when we couldn't, trying to deal with the environment, trying to deal with our Indigenous issues. We didn't even have a foot in the front door. And when the law changed in 1951 and we were finally able to go to court because we weren't allowed, lawyers were not allowed to represent us before that. And so, and there were organizations of the Indigenous people. I mean, to take a court case all the way to the Supreme Court of Canada cost millions of dollars. And there were people that helped, and I have to acknowledge that there are organizations that help raise the funds to get those court cases. And we have won, I don't know how many in the Supreme Court, but we have won like over 300 court cases, and yet, we're still haven't moved that far ahead. But it's when the individual people like yourselves start educating yourself and start to learn about this stuff, and the politicians listen to those that vote them in. And so that's my hope, is that people will really start to educate themselves and hold the politicians to account. So that's my hope. And with the environment, there are so many things that are just so wrong with the way things happen. But I think that too, there's becoming, and the Indigenous way of dealing with the environment, that's the governments are recognizing that Indigenous people, when they're put in charge of a certain area, those environments are more healthier than other places. So we're also trying to get our voices heard on an equal level. And as people start realizing they, individuals as well, can push the politicians to make those changes. So, yeah, I mean, if I didn't have hope, I might be on the streets myself, but I've got 2 great grandbabies now, and I've got grandchildren and children, and it's one of the things that in the Indigenous ways is that you have to think 7 generations ahead. Those children have rights, but in Canadian law, a baby doesn't have any rights unless it's born alive. And those generations ahead have no rights at all. So we, trying to get people to change the way they think and really think about what's best for everybody. And so that's something I've always said, that there needs to be a court case put forward on the 7 generations ahead, because in the Indigenous laws, they have rights. So, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, Bev. Anybody? Vanessa, did you want to ask a question?
Bev, I'm really intrigued about what you just said at the end there, that you always say that there should be a court case put forward for the 7 generations ahead. What might be asked or challenged in that case?
Sorry, what might
that, so I'd be interested in what the court case should be about when you say, like, in Indigenous law, we think about 7 generations from now.
Yeah, 7
what
generations.
Thinking about for 7 generations from now. Teach us that way of being.
Well, in 7 generations, the children have rights to a healthy environment. So what we do today is affecting them. But I've talked to lawyers, practicing lawyers. I'm not a practicing lawyer. I've talked to lawyers about this, and they've tried to think of ways to get it into the Canadian court case, courts, and they haven't been able to come up with anything. But I keep talking to people about it, and I'm hoping that the Canadian court system is a flawed system, and there's so many things that matter with it, but they have rights 7 generations ahead. So, it's my ancestors fought for me having a healthy environment, so, and they lived a life to make sure that we did have a healthy environment. And I remember my grandmother, when she was in her 80s or 90s, I can't remember exactly how old she was, but she was still mad at this one woman who didn't clean up after herself down the river. She left garbage there, and that was a big no-no. And then, when I would go out on the land with them, she couldn't believe that people left garbage out on the land. We would be out there. My son, my youngest son, when he goes out, he's always cleaning up. He goes out and visiting somewhere or whatever. The first thing that he does is he starts picking up garbage, and it makes him so angry, so, but people throw things away and don't even think about it, or go out and buy all kinds of crap that's going to end up in the landfill, and people have to start thinking of that. And what we're doing is affecting 7 generations ahead. So, yeah, so that's, and I don't know, I've been trying to Oh, I don't know. I don't know how to do it, but
Bev, can I just ask one more question? I feel so drawn to this concept. Is there anywhere I can read more about that in the Indigenous teaching about just being aware of the 7 generations?
it's common. It's common in most.
Maybe if I Google it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Let me see. Where could you read about that? Oh, geez. I'm going to have to think about that. Yeah,
I think it's such a powerful concept. I work in healthcare, and just even we're trying to become more conscious of the environmental impact of healthcare. Because if global healthcare was put together, it would be the 5th largest emitter of carbon in the world. And when you think about how counterproductive that is to healthcare, but it's hard to get the decision makers of healthcare to kind of focus energy on that because there's so many competing priorities and so few resources, and yet it seems so important.
Yeah, you're over in Toronto. I'm not sure what tribes are over there, but I bet you anything, if you made contact with them, they would have something somewhere, like in the Seguetan clause, it's in the stories and stuff like that. But in your area, it would be good if you, because we're all so different, like it's like Europe. The French didn't think they were the same as the Italian, and the English didn't think they were the same as Scandinavia or whatever. And that's how the Indigenous people are right across Canada. We're so different. Even in the province of BC, the interior tribes are different from the coastal tribes. And so, yeah, so if you reached out to someone in your area, and that would be more appropriate. You don't want to take the stuff from BC and talk about it. But I bet you anything they could direct you to where you could find that stuff, and go talk to an elder, or I don't know. They must have something over there. So that would be my advice to you.
That's good advice, Bev. There's lots of organizations here that we can reach out to for that
Right on.
information. Yeah.
Excellent.
Anybody have a question for?
And if you have a question later on, if you don't think of it now, you have my email address, just send it, and I always answer any questions.
Two hands just flew up.
Sorry?
Mary Ellen and then Paulina.
All righty.
Yes, just 2 things, in relationship to what you've said, Bev. One, just in terms of the 7 generations, it was such a surprising discovery for me that people who have property, so a building, they are legally, or what, I don't know how to say it, but they've got protection of the atmosphere above their building so high, in case they were in need for something else, or to protect their building from being demolished and a great big high rise going up. So, that's for property.
Mm-hmm.
And that protection is possible. So I can't understand why a really good lawyer couldn't come up with something to protect into the future.
That's actually a good analogy, and I never thought of that. So I'm going to go and talk to somebody about it. It's the same like a corporation. A corporation has the same status of a person.
Yeah.
And Indigenous people around the world now are trying to get that same status for waterways and other areas, and there's no reason why we can't do that. I mean, the Fraser River in BC should have legal status, and that somebody can bring a court case on its behalf. Yeah, so
I'm really, really grateful that you've brought that up, because that for me is something that I'm aware of, and I would really, really want to support. And I'd like to be supporting Indigenous communities who are fighting for that.
Yeah.
And
okay.
to find out, I did try at one point somewhat to find out what group here in Ontario was actually, I know there are some who are working on that.
Yeah.
The other thing that I just want to say, because one of the things that I want to keep working for is nonviolence. And so everything that you have spoken of is about violence. And how do we, as a humanity, grow in respect for the way of nonviolence? So that applies to persons, but it also applies to land. If the people who leave their garbage could see that that in fact is a violent act, and I must say that I just have the greatest, I'm really drawn to the Indigenous value of respect. If we really, really understood what respect means and what it implies,
Yeah,
we wouldn't behave the way we do.
that's true. Yeah, well, a lot of people wouldn't behave, unfortunately. There's still going to be those who don't care. But I mean, like if there's that tipping point, you get a certain number of people caring about something and then it changes. So,
Yes.
I mean, before there was a prophecy. I heard a prophecy when I was young. I don't know, I might have been in my teens, and it was a prophecy, I think by the Navajo I think it was the Navajo, that at one point people were going to be turning back to the Indigenous people to teach them about how to live on the land. And when I heard it, I was like, oh, that's never going to happen. Oh yeah, whatever. And now that's what's happening, and even, like in the government is, I'm part of this group where we have Indigenous guardians on the land and Indigenous protected conserved areas. And the governments are even, saying things like, letting people know that where Indigenous people, have a say in the land, those environments are healthy. So it's starting to come around now. So hopefully it continues.
Mhm.
And again, that's another form of hope. Yeah.
Yes, thank you. Paulina, you put your hand up. Do you still have a question?
Well, I just wondered, I was very interested. Thank you, Joan. Bev, I so enjoyed reading your book, and I say I enjoyed it because I learned so much. And I found that your book was such a story of resilience. It was filled really with touching every emotion that I carry in my spirit and in my heart. And I wondered what the writing process was like for you. How did you find writing the book? What was your journey like in the writing?
Well, I didn't start out with writing a book. When we invited Roland Christian over, and when we started looking at why there was so much chaos in our communities, why there was so much drinking, why there was so much violence in our communities and stuff, and I started to connect the dots from my childhood to my adulthood. And at that point, I was really trying to change the way I was. I knew I didn't have a word for it, but I knew I wanted to change. And I knew I didn't like to be the way I was. And I had 3 kids and wanted to make a better life for them. And so wanted to change it. And it was when I started connecting the dots, and I would think of something that happened in my childhood and how it connected to my adulthood. And so I would write little things, and going over it in my mind, like writing it all down and then really understanding it. That's what writing did for me. So, but it was never meant to be a book. It was just as a personally for me to understand myself. And as I started to understand myself, I started to understand my mom. And I was really bitter towards my mom for years, for a number of things. And then when I understood mom, and then I understood the community, and then Indigenous people in general, so I ended up with a whole big folder full of little stories. And my husband He didn't go to the residential school. Both his parents went. But he didn't know anything about them. And it was like my kids, they didn't know anything about the res. They knew that my grandmother, my mom and I went, and our other family members, but that's all they knew. And so when I showed Bill those notes, he told me that I should turn it into a book. And I was like, oh my God, no, there was no way that I wanted to put it out there. But then I started, there were stories that I couldn't quite remember. Like I knew part of the stories, like when those girls ran away from the mission and they had their heads shaved. They were strapped in front of all of us, and then they had their head shaved. And part of that story was missing, and so I got a hold of them, and they filled it in. And then when I started doing that and showing people the stories, they were telling me, you need to publish it, you need to publish it. And then I had all these stories, but I didn't know how to turn it into a book. Once I decided to publish it, and so somebody suggested that I needed a structural editor. And he took all my little stories, and about 2 months later, he sent me back what was a book. I was amazed. I didn't even know there were editors like that, but I had no idea what to do with it. So that's what happened. And it's kind of funny because my mom, she was the one that she's gone now. She died about 3 years ago. But when the book was going to come out, and when she heard from somewhere a few years, that I was writing a book, and she tells me, you better not be writing anything about me in there. And I couldn't write the book without having her in there. And I thought maybe I might have to wait until she died. But the draft of the book was done, and I brought it down. My mom lives about 6 miles from me, or she lived about 6 miles from me. And I went down there and I told her, Mom, I wrote this book, and I put it on the table. And she just kind of looked at it. She never said anything. And I said, maybe you'd like to read it. And she didn't say anything, and I left, and I'm waiting, and 2 weeks has gone by and no word from Mom. I was expecting her to phone me and just tie into me or something. I don't know what, but anyways, I went down there. I was curious, so I went down about 2 weeks later, and I told her, did you read the book? And she says, yeah. And I told her, what do you think? She says, you need to publish it. so that's how that, if Mom didn't give the go ahead, I would have never published it. Yeah. But she wanted her story when she was charged with murder, and she took the blame for murdering somebody. And it always bothered her that people thought she was a murderer, and she wanted that story in there. So, and some of the other stuff, yeah, she was okay with it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
It should really be in schools. It really should. I mentioned that in the introduction. I don't know if there's ever any talk in BC of getting it into the curriculum. It's very accessible. It would be a great book for students to read, young people to read.
Yeah, I agree. The same with my second book, Price Paid. It's the 5th year now that it's been made mandatory at the Sauder School of Business at UBC. It's mandatory for every student to read. It's one of their core courses. Yeah, so.
Great.
Mm-hmm.
Good.
Oh, somebody's got their hand up.
Thank you very much, Bev, for your book and for everything you're sharing. So you mentioned that story about the RCMP and the fact that white people are also in need of healing. And I mean, history shows obviously that we've brought a lot of pain and do you have any interpretation of or theory of where that could come from? Why is that so that we colonized everywhere and without paying attention and being so insensitive and so on? Is there any theory, any roots that we could look at and try to help us all collectively heal?
I've asked myself that question a million times, and I was like, what? People think they're better than others, you know, when you, I remember as a young girl, and I was telling somebody about another young woman about, you know, white people being better. And she was a young white girl. And she says, are you kidding? Is that what you think? Anyway, I don't know. I think part of it comes from, I have never read the Bible, but I've heard that part of it comes from the Bible. And then people are just, you know, I don't know, you so different, you know, if you don't understand something, you want to squash it, you know. So the way that Indigenous people lived, the way they thought about the land, I mean, you know, just the fact that children were, I mean, treated so well in you know, in the Indigenous world, the greatest resource that we had aside from the land and the water and everything were the children. And I was shocked when I started, what's that show, Les Miserables, with the children, you know, as slaves, and then with other shows, even the one, that lady that comes down on the umbrella, you know, and they have chimney sweeps and stuff like that. And in Les Miserables, I couldn't believe that that guy was put in jail for stealing bread. You know, his family was hungry, and I was like, why don't they just give it to him? Why don't they just share? You know, in our communities here, I say that our greatest strength was sharing. You know, even today, we're the poorest of the poor, and we survived by sharing. My son just got a moose a couple of years ago, and we've got barely anything in our fridge. He took it out and he shared it with the family, you know, so he kept a few pieces for ourselves, you know, yeah, you know, and I say, but our biggest weakness was sharing too, because when we shared, there was no reciprocal action, you know, and it just took and took and took. But I don't know, I haven't really studied that, but I know, you know, part of it comes from the Bible, and then just not knowing, fear of the unknown, I guess, I don't know. Thinking your ways are the best when they're not. And I always tell people, you know, it's too bad that we couldn't have taken the best from every culture that came here, because it's, you know, not just the Indigenous people that contributed so much. There's, you know, so much more that other cultures have contributed to the world. So if we ever get there and share alike and appreciate everyone, yeah, that'd be great. Yeah, everybody on an equal level.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Bev. It has been, it's been our privilege to have you as a guest this evening. I think everybody would agree. And if we should probably, just looking at the time, we should probably start saying goodbye, unless somebody is just dying to get one more question in before we say goodbye. I don't want to say goodbye. We could keep talking all night, Bev, but.
Yeah. Well, as I said, you have my email, and if somebody has a question, just put it to me. Yeah. And thank you very much for inviting me. I enjoyed doing things like this, and I was sorry I had to cancel, because people want to understand, you know, and I think understanding is the first step in everything, you know, and changing things. So. Yeah.
Well, and I think it makes a real difference when it comes from somebody with the lived experience and the ability to do as you have done, is to kind of analyze it, sort it out, make sense of it to yourself, so that we can now understand it a little bit better. So deeply, deeply, deeply grateful that you've agreed to speak to us. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bev.
How do you do a round of applause on Zoom when everybody's muted?
Oh, you clap in the reaction, I think. I like
Just
to
do this.
Oh, here, look. It's such a gift.
Take care.
Thank you.
Bev, enjoy your grandbabies.
Oh, you're back. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Thank
Take
you.
care. Good night.